welcome back to another video in our video series. And today the algorithm that we're going to be solving together is how to calculate the cumulative standard deviation. And so we're basically going to take a function, have an array of numbers as the parameter, and return the standard deviation from this series. And so basically standard deviation is basically a measure of how spread out a data set is. We learned about it in grade school. We learned about it in our statistics class, and it pretty much determines the volatility of the data set or determines the margin of error of the data set. And basically it's used in a ton of applications across the business sector, finance sector, and even in programming. And this is an example of standard deviation curve that we probably seen in grade school. And let's just get straight to it because the problem is basically to figure this out. And before we actually solve standard deviation, I want to go over a few mathematical formulas with you so that we know the steps on how to solve standard deviation before we actually write a program in JavaScript. And so assume that we have a data set with an array that has the values 1, 2, and 3. The first step in solving standard deviation is we need to calculate the average. And the mathematical average formula is here, in which we take each value of the array, sum it all up, and divide it by the length of the array. The next step in solving standard deviation is we need to subtract each value from the array with the average that we computed in the previous example, and then we have to square it all up. So basically, we're pretty much saying 1 minus the average squared, 2 minus the average squared, 3 minus the average squared. Third step in calculating standard deviation is we need to calculate the variance. And the formula for variance is with all the values that we computed from example 2, we pretty much say, this for first example, 1 minus the average squared plus 2 minus the average squared plus 3 minus the average squared divided by the length of the array. So we're pretty much summing all the values that we computed in formula 2 and dividing it by the size of the array. And basically the last step in solving standard deviation is pretty much we're just going to square root the value that we computed in example 3, and that's going to be our final value. I know I talked a lot right there, and I know that could have been a little cumbersome, but I think it's pretty important in understanding how standard deviation works, or more specifically, how any problem works before actually writing code for it. And so in order to save us a little bit of time, I wrote the pseudocode that I just explained in the PowerPoint here so that we don't have to go over it again and waste more time. And let's get straight to it. And so let's say that sum is equal to 0. And in the first step, we're going to calculate the average. So in order to do that, I'm going to create a simple for loop here. I is less than array.length, I plus plus. And basically all I'm going to say is sum plus equal array of I. And we're just going to say const average is going to be equal to sum divided by array.length. Const average divided by array.length. And let's just console.log this value to see that we're on the right track. And yep, that looks like the approximate average for this data set. And so let's go to problem 2. We're going to subtract each value of the data set with the average and square it. And so pretty much I'm going to combine steps 2 and 3 so that we don't have to do a double for loop. And this will be more clear in just a second. So let's actually say let variance equal to 0. And so let's create a for loop here for let I equal to 0. I is less than array.length, I plus plus. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to say math.pal And we're just going to say array of I minus average 2. So we're going to say variance plus equals math.pow array of I minus the average. And we're also going to say variance is equal to variance divided by array.length. Let's console.log this value. So we want to know for sure that if this is really the standard deviation. So let's square root this. So we're going to say const standard deviation is equal to variance divided by math dot square root. And we're going to say variance here. Console.log this just to see everything is working, but I'm pretty sure this is the right answer because right here it says that the standard deviation of the first data set is 2, and it seems like everything is working just fine. And so standard deviation. So before I submit this, this is not going to work only because right here in our testing conditions, it pretty much wants us to submit it to 3 decimal points. So this test is not going to work because we're going to have to submit this to 3 data set, 3 decimal points. And so basically, let's add a condition here to check to see if it's an integer. So if number dot is integer of standard deviation, let's just return the normal value of standard deviation here because we have no fixed numbers that we have to do. Else, we're going to say we're going to return standard deviation dot to fixed. And let's say the number 3. So everything seems to be working here. And the only reason I added this condition here on the bottom was because in the testing conditions, it wants us to return the values to 3 decimal points. And if I don't fix it to 3 decimal points, it's going to just have a long string of decimals for some of these problem sets, which is not what the algorithm here is asking for. And so just a brief recap of what we did. We got the average of the data set. We added each value of we subtracted each value of the data set with the average, and we squared it, and we also added it to the variance variable. And then we also computed the variance variable by dividing it by the length of the array. So this is the real value of the variance here. And then to calculate the standard deviation, the formula is just the square root the variance. And in the final section, we check to see if the number is an integer. If it is, we're just going to return the standard deviation as it is. But if the number is a floating point number or it's a decimal number, we're going to fix the number of decimals to 3, and we're going to return that value. And so I know the explanation for this problem was really long, but in reality, this algorithm's execution was fairly simple. And so that's the end of this algorithm. I hope you really enjoyed it. I know this was a little bit different than some of the other algorithms that we solved together, but I'm glad that I shared this with you, and I'll see you next time.